Hello and welcome to Life's Booming. I'm James Valentine and this season we're talking about death. And in this episode, we're talking about matters of life and death, well, the final matter, how we say goodbye. Death is big business and Australia's death care and funeral industry is worth more than $2 billion. And with us are two entrepreneurs, two people who work in this area, supporting you and your loved ones through the last step on life's journey. We're joined by Dr Annetta Mallon, an end-of-life consultant and educator, and also known as a death doula. And Martin Tobin is a recognised family name in the funeral business and is now an expert advisor on the global funeral industry. Annetta, Martin, welcome to Life's Booming. So many places to start. I'm excited. And Martin, I'll start with you. What's it like when the family business is death?
Yeah, well, it's all I've ever known. When I was born and grew up, we actually lived in a funeral parlour. So for the first 2 or 3 years of my life, the funeral parlour was downstairs. We lived upstairs. So when it's all you've known, you don't think anything different of it. And I suppose all of my friends and sort of social groups when I was young and a teenager thought it was pretty quirky and funny. But for me, it was what I knew. My grandfather and his brothers started our family business in the 30s, and by the time I came along, it was well and truly established. And I didn't really work directly in it straight away after leaving school, but it was always in the background, and so I've always been comfortable with it.
Yeah. But such an interesting thing. Like, what's the dinner time conversation? Did you have a good day, Nelly? Good deaths? Some good deaths?
Well, all of that, I think that's the stereotype, isn't it? The funeral directors are a bit sort of weird and severe and a bit morbid, but it's far from the truth. I think most of the people who work in funeral service and in the work that Annetta does are really warm and loving and gregarious people, because you have to have those qualities to really survive and thrive in what we do in that space.
You kind of got to love life, Annetta.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We are fiercely alive until we are dead.
That's right.
And I think that whether it's from the professional funeral side of things or more from consumer advocate and personal support side of things, coming in with a joke, why do we screw the coffin lids down so hard? To keep the oncologists out.
Yeah.
Great icebreaker. Show up with cake, make joke, because most of us have a lot of laughter and love in our lives. And it's important to leaven sorrow and grief.
Yeah.
Don't let it just drown out the...
What's the Undertaker's joke?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, everyone I used to get called Stiffy Tobin, that sort of stuff.
Stiffy Tobin.
A bit. So a lot of funeral directors get called Stiffy.
That's a 1930s cartoon character,
isn't it? Yeah. It's like it's the Millers and Bakers are Dusty. It's that era.
You're a Tintin character.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, luckily I wasn't, I don't fit the stereotype of tall and grey. I'm sort of fairly short and not grey. So when I joined our family business, I was quite young. So I was lucky to sort of didn't fit that stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the early 90s, there was very few women, very few people, young people, very few people from diverse backgrounds. So it's changed a lot really for the better in that sense. So there's no stereotypical funeral director now. It's really, really diverse.
What's a doula?
Well, a doula is someone who supports life's transitions. So I've been a birth doula, and it's a very powerful energy when someone comes into the world, but it's really not my jam. I like the other transition, and I'm better at it. I provide an awful lot of information for people who have questions. What is this going to feel like? Should I be at home or should I be in the hospital? And the point of a lot of my conversations is not to provide answers, but to support people into recognizing what's best for them, which I suspect is actually quite a lot of what Martin does with the way that you work with businesses.
Yeah. When do you turn up?
Piece of string question. I can turn up pre-need, so there's no terminal or life-limiting diagnosis. There's a bit of a myth that we turn up magically like a fairy in the last 24 hours of life. That's not really great or optimal.
So do some people get you, even if I don't have a diagnosis, but I want to start working with a doula?
If you're a doula like me who does planning and can answer questions and help people prepare their documentation and their wishes, because that's not anything you want to be doing at the last minute. And in cases where there's dementia and cognitive decline, it's too late then to get your planning in place. So I also help to support and foster family-wide and network-wide conversations so that everyone understands if someone's interested in assisted dying. Let's talk about that. Does anyone have questions, for example? Or have you considered your pets in your planning? Are you including your grandchildren or just your children? Would you prefer to die in a medicalized environment, ideally, or in a home-like environment?
So so you're there at any point, and really every circumstance is entirely different.
It is. It's unique every single time.
Mm. Same for funerals?
Yeah, I mean, a funeral really should be a reflection of the person's life and interests and values and philosophies. And sometimes, historically, traditionally, in, say, the last couple of 100 years, that often revolved around their faith. So these days, funerals are quite sort of open-ended, quite unstructured, quite celebratory. And people are trying to find some ritual in that and some meaning in that, and that's the real change that's happening in funeral service. Funerals have been going on for thousands of years. They're one of the early rituals of human existence. So, and they emanate from the human need to stop when someone from among us leaves us, and reflect on that person's life, to typically grieve that person if they meant something to us. So that is to, invariably people feel sad, not always, but typically. And people have to then say, well, how do we move forward without this person? And then for a lot of people, that's incredibly difficult. Grief is just our response to loss. You can't control it. You can't make it go away. So if you suppress it in the early days, it comes back to bite you later. So a funeral is a chance to gather, reflect, embrace the reality of the death, and embrace the early stages of the grief, the pain that you'll often experience, and to receive support from your community, and to let go of that person, because they go from being with you to being a memory.
So it's interesting the way you phrase it, or the point of view you expressed there was, to me, it was the person closest to whoever's died. It's for them, and then it's for the community. It's sort of for us. Funeral's not for the guy that died. The funeral's for us.
Yeah, that's right. And we're finding a lot of people are now trying to sort of orchestrate their own celebration and say, this is what I want, and I want this to happen, that to happen. And that's got a place, but it's really for the living, for those that are left behind. And the dead can't tell the living how to feel, but they can give guidance and direction. But I think it's really important that the funerals are done the way that the survivors feel they need to do it, so that helps them get back into life afterwards.
Yeah. Would you agree? What's a funeral for?
I think a funeral is an opportunity to remember why your person was so important to you. One of the big changes that I think we're going to see more and more of in Australia now, with assisted dying nationally available, is a fabulous going away party, as I call them. So people who attend their own funerals. Because basically, especially if you're in a hospital, you know when your time is coming. So there's almost like a bookending effect where we have a celebration with the person and they get to say goodbyes and explain to people why they were important and hear all the good stuff. And then there's probably going to be a gathering of some kind afterwards. Possibly ham rolls and whiskey will play a part. Because, as Martin has said, we need to commemorate the fact that this aspect of our lives is now irrevocably changed. I think for a lot of us, the relationship goes on, but it's very different. I still talk to my mother and my grandmother, both of whom are dead. I don't expect them to respond. But there's still
I think that's the sane way to do it. If you're expecting to respond,
that's a different conversation. Yeah,
we're doing another whole episode on that, from beyond the grave. So again, the funeral's not really for the dead person.
I've never thought a funeral is for the dead person. It is to really bring us out of the immense shock of the raw grief that, and this is a generalization, is about 72 hours. So, and that's not a sustainable emotional state. We get to come together, we get to shift from intense grief, the personal experience of loss and that response. Because grief is love with no place left to be put. into mourning, which is a more shared communal public sense of loss, which is a really important transitional period in accepting a death, coming to terms with a death, acknowledging a death. And the funeral makes a space that I think is important, not just for the closest people, but for friends, work colleagues, community members. So there is a space that can be welcoming for a variety of community members, which is also really important. Community can be quite intimate and small. It can be broader and more encompassing.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it does need to. I think a good funeral will reflect the person's life. If it's not authentic, if you go to that funeral and you say, "Gee, that wasn't about Fred," then clearly the family have got it wrong. So they have to be the central character. It has to really reflect who they were, ideally. But if Fred starts micromanaging his service, his celebration, then I think we're missing the point, because it really is for those left behind to say, what's going to be meaningful for me to help me, take stock of my life now that Fred's gone. A good example is, sometimes people these days will often say, look, let's not go to the fuss of a funeral. Let's have a private cremation or burial, and we'll have a memorial service, which is fine, and a lot of people choose that. But if Fred's not there, the emotions around how people feel about Fred and the stories about him aren't heightened enough for people to really feel what they should feel at a funeral. It's hard to sort of get started with your grief. It's sort of the
but I suppose there's often that's often thought of, we're going to do this in a few days, but the memorial's in 2 weeks.
I think it's individual, and I also think it is broader culture. So, for example, in some cultures from Eastern Europe, there are marker days. So you will have the funeral on a particular day, and then you might do something 10 days later, and then the 40th day might be, for example, in the Macedonian community. I still pay attention to death anniversaries. And I pay attention to it because it's going to affect my mood and the way I go throughout the day, because I will be thinking about that person. And ideally, you have had the opportunity to spend time with your person, whether that's in a hospital room. For example, I did that when my mother died. We were allowed to have the room for as long as we wanted with her. Or at home, and you might keep your person at home for a day or two and sing to them, wash them, sit in silence, cry with them, laugh with them. That can be part of the saying goodbye, which the funeral then, when it's done properly and appropriately, I think sort of wraps everything up and ties it as neatly together as you can, so that you can move into all of the afters of grief.
Martin, let's talk about the business of funerals. It's a big business, isn't it?
Well, it became an industry 100 plus years ago, something that people started outsourcing to, and initially it was outsourced to cabinet makers who made the coffin. And then the cabinet maker said, well, not only can I make the coffin, but I can transfer the body from the place of death. And over a period of time, it became an industry. So it is there, it is an organised industry in most countries around the world. And so the organised funeral director will provide a range of services to, support people who've lost someone. In Australia, it's primarily historically made up of family-owned private businesses that are multi-generational family businesses. But about 25 years or so ago, a lot of the well-known family businesses were purchased by larger groups. But certainly, in my view, they're at a competitive disadvantage to a genuinely family-owned, local, community-based, family-owned business. Because they just don't have that essence.
Yeah. Is it a strange thing? You've talked very compassionately about grief and about the humanity of what's involved, about the moment of death and what people are dealing with. Yet this is something that you'll make profit from, that the company's going to make profit from. Is that a strange, is there a conflict there?
There isn't really. I sometimes I think a lot of the people who are attracted to the industry, they're talking to a family and they've gone through a loss, and there's a lot of grief and pain. And there might be some challenging financial circumstances too that they glean from the conversation, and that people feel oh gee, how can we add pain to send them an invoice for $10,000, whatever it might be, and on top of what they're already experiencing. So it is a little bit uncomfortable, but I think if the business has integrity around its pricing and there's genuine options and they're not sort of forced into any sort of uncomfortable decisions, then most people recognise that a funeral, if it's needs to be done in a certain way, there's going to be a cost to that.
And do you find, Annetta, that the rise of doulas, the presence of doulas, the change, the way in which there seems to be a lot of alternatives to those bigger companies, or that standard sort of the mahogany casket approach, is that in a reaction to this sort of somewhat industrialization of the process?
Partially, yes. And from my perspective, I think we can, okay, Boomer, let's give you a big vote of thanks. Because at every stage of life, the Boomer generation, it's a cliche for a reason, they've demanded information and choice, and they want things on their terms far more than we'd seen in the silent generation, certainly, and previous generations. So what are my rights, options, and choices at end of life? What can we do better and differently? It's made space for things like Daisy Box Caskets Australia. I'm not affiliated with them, but they offer a lower and a high-quality product, but it's less expensive than mahogany, which you mentioned. Not a bad option for families on a budget, not a bad option for cremations. I think, as we are in such an almost overwhelm of information age, people do want to know what's possible. And we can readily see that, for example, in the USA, we've got Katrina Spade, who started with the Urban Death Project.
And what's that?
The Urban Death Project was an architectural hypothetical exercise. How can we offer a space for respectful memorialization and body disposition that is not taking up valuable land?
Right.
And from this, then we have Recompose, which is natural organic reduction, nor human composting. In Tasmania, we've got the very first water-based cremation service.
What is that? Because, cremation implies fire to me, not water.
Yes. So it's alkaline hydrolysis. It's a high-temperature, high alkaline process of dissolving everything, which at the end you get a product that instead of grey ash is white. You get a completely sterile liquid that I personally don't see why we can't use on green spaces, urban green spaces, but it can go down the drain.
Just water me in the park.
Yeah.
Just go
Exactly.
water the flowers with me.
I quite like that.
Splash me into the ocean with
Splash
the
me
rest
in
of
the
the
ocean.
water.
Yeah.
There we go. And it's about 1/7 of the environmental footprint of a flame cremation. Costs about the same, maybe a little bit more, but we also have a team that will transport statewide.
Right.
We don't do natural burial.
Right.
We don't have dedicated natural burial spaces in Australia.
And
The
again,
UK does it really well.
What's natural burial?
Okay, so instead of going down 6 feet, into colder ground, which is anaerobic, there's frequently a lot of concrete involved. You're in essentially like a hotter ground. You've got more microbes and oxygen. You're going to break down faster. And in the UK, the multi-purpose spaces where you might be running sheep, for example, or growing wildflowers or food. So in the USA, when you have the composted remains of people, which turns out to be quite a lot, large in volume, they work with a national park. And it actually goes to beautify hiking trails and to recondition public spaces.
I like all these.
I like it too.
They're kind of positive, aren't they?
There's
They're
options for
positive
everybody.
options, yeah.
So it's opening up spaces for non-medical, community-based people like myself. It also means that there's new and exciting ways for funeral directors to then work with people to make the meaningful, personalized ritual and ceremony and funeral experience. So thank you, Boomers. We've got a lot of change.
Yeah. And are the traditional companies, are they embracing this? Are they seeing the need to embrace this?
The traditional funeral of being in a church and sort of straight to the cemetery with everything sort of reasonably structured, and that pattern has definitely broken. We're seeing two things in the Australian industry, that is people trending, or consumers saying that doesn't do it for me anymore. I'm either going for something very simple that's low cost and where there's not much of a fuss, or people are saying I want something highly customized, highly celebratory, highly innovative, and the companies that have stayed quite traditional and conservative are actually losing relevance. And so the funeral directors who are seeing those baby boomer led changes and are responding, who are responding or actually leading the way themselves and coming up with some of those ideas themselves, they're the ones that are staying relevant and are thriving. There's a funeral company called Tender Funerals whose focus and philosophy is that the family are much more involved in the actual funeral, which is a great thing, which is how it used to be. The family themselves would.
So what might take place? What do they do?
Well, they might wash and dress the body, as Annetta said. They might carry the coffin in some of the steps that normally the funeral director would only do. There's subtle differences, and I don't profess to know a lot about what they do, but philosophically, their message is, let's do funerals the way they used to be done, and and not outsource everything to the funeral director. So that's a challenge for the organised industry, because that people are responding to that, and because people are saying, yeah, actually that's how we did used to do it. And I think the work that doulas are doing is getting people comfortable with the conversation. The fact that we all die, and that
we've checked. Everyone does.
Yeah, we went through that before.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, the organised industry has to realise that with education and boomer-led sort of innovation, there's a lot more, sort of change and sort of innovation they have to embrace. Otherwise, they will become irrelevant.
Whether you're coming from a more business-like perspective or something that's more community-led, we all offer skills and services that have value. People trained to be funeral directors and celebrants. People trained to be morticians. People trained to be doulas. And there's an awful lot of ongoing research and continuing education, because the legislation is changing very quickly in terms of documentation, where it's stored, how it's processed. Assisted dying is constantly changing as we review the laws. And there is a value to that. I'm not a charity. I like to eat meals and sleep under a roof. So I think one of the unexpected benefits of having more open conversations generally is people can recognize, oh, well, maybe this much for a funeral seems too much, but this is a reasonable sum, and I'm happy to pay that sum because we're getting something of value in the end that may be more personalized, maybe more ritualized and traditional, but then we have an exchange of something for something.
Yeah. But also those the kind of, those newer processes you were describing, even of how we dispose of the body, a more sustainable approach, is going to reflect a lot of people's values, in a way that a traditional casket being buried at 6 feet under.
Funerals don't operate in a vacuum. They're part of the broader society.
Yeah. Why do you like working in the area of death?
It's a real privilege to work with. I mean, the work that Annetta does is amazing. Like to have an open conversation with someone who's facing their own mortality every day must be an amazing privilege. And the work that I've done historically is after that. So it's not as confronting, not as because it's happened, but it's just really satisfying work to help people, when they are at a low point, to do something for them that's valuable, that's meaningful, and to help them with the long-term journey they're about to embark on. A funeral is just one of the first steps in their overall journey without that person. And if you can get them off to a good start with a good, this notion of a good funeral, then it's incredibly satisfying work. The vast majority of the people that work in funeral service, and I'm sure in the work that you do, are there for the right reasons. They're there because they are people-driven people. They love helping. They want to make a difference for people. So it's a very satisfying industry. But most people, we have the stereotype of we're all a bit weird, and that it's almost the opposite.
And then why do you like it? You said you were better than this. You'd been a birth doula, and you said, "Oh no, but I'm better at death."
I am better at death. I like puppies, not children, which probably explains a lot. I'm a good story keeper, and someone who is at end of life or is coming to terms with a life-limiting or terminal diagnosis, maybe a slower decline or more rapid decline, there is still an essence of themselves that they would like to have preserved, which I think feeds into this idea of the meaningful, purposeful funeral. the meaningful, purposeful end of life with quality of life until we die, and then trying to offer a quality of life to people as they come to terms with the death of their person, is values driven, I think, in terms of planning. And also, for me, it's about honoring that person and trying to empower them with as much information as appropriate so that they can make informed decisions. I think there's nothing more empowering. When I've done my job really right, I'm not even involved when someone dies. Sometimes I'm in the room, and that's okay. But often I will hear from families afterwards. And there's wonderful stories about the time that was spent while their person was dying, caring for their person's body after death, how the family and the friends came together to facilitate all of that, and then how that relationship of community changes or stays the same following that. So people then find meaning in their own life, get more excited about planning. The death literacy snowball is a wonderful thing to watch in action. It's my jam. I really love it.
What do they do? What have people told you about death?
Interestingly enough, for a lot of people, it's not about death itself. It's about being frightened of dying. My pain threshold's in the basement. I don't want to be in pain. That bothers me far more than my moment of death. That the people they loved know that they're loved. That
They want that. They want
they
them to know.
want that.
Yeah,
they
yeah.
want to know that love has been expressed, which I think is possibly why we're seeing that uptick too in people saying, I'd like this playlist at my... I always start with a playlist with planning, control it, be the DJ. Could we talk about this? I'd like these elements, because it's a way of caretaking, in a sense, the people that they're going to leave behind. The messages that people leave are messages of love.
Yeah.
I think that's something the film Love actually got really right
Yeah.
in the beginning. How do I convey that? How can I try and make that my legacy? So we're seeing a rise in life writing, the narrative of someone's life, so that there might be a digital book or voice recordings. We're seeing that with social media platforms where social accounts can be turned into memorial accounts. But I think also we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that sometimes that is all yanked away with no warning, sometimes by family members who think that that's the right thing to do, and that can leave people devastated. So I think we're all kind of jogging along together, trying to come to terms with all the changes and make them a good fit for individuals.
Yeah. Martin, what do you hear? What do you hear people say about death?
Most people dread the day. They're dreading the day. They have to get up there in front of all those people, walk through the gathering, and everyone's looking at them. And so there's a lot of dread. People will say, can we just get over and done with? Can we do it tomorrow, when the death's been today or whatever? So there is that sense that it's going to be an ordeal. So if after it's happened and the feedback is, or the conversations you hear are, oh, that was really special and it went well, and what a tribute we paid to Dad or Mum, he would have loved it, or whatever. That you've lifted all that dread away, and then they move ahead. So they're off to a good start. Otherwise, if we just die and we pause for a few minutes and we get back on the bike and start living again, well, that person's what they meant to us, and all their stories and history and what they wanted to be said about them just gets shuffled aside, and we get on with life again. So I think most of us deserve a bit better than that. And a funeral's a really good opportunity to just stop the clock for a while. We don't have to wallow in it for weeks. And some cultures do. They put a real ritual around. But as a minimum, just have some chance where we can say this life mattered. I think that's really good.
Yeah. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much, Nana. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, James. It's been a pleasure.
Martin, thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks to our guests, Dr Annetta Mallon and Martin Tobin. You've been listening to Season 6 of Life's Booming, Dying to Know, brought to you by Australian Seniors. please leave a review or tell someone about it. Head to seniors.com.au/podcast for more episodes. May your life be booming. I'm James Valentine.